We're going to talk about cost today. So I'm going to bait this a little bit, but how many people are focused on either reducing or maintaining the cost of their data stack this year? Okay, that's probably like sampling bias because you're all here. But yeah, I think this is definitely a really big focus for data teams today. So we're going to dive deep into this topic today. I'll skip this because I think Carlos already gave a pretty good introduction, but I will mention my podcast really quickly as well. We have a gender diversity problem in data. I think I see a lot of women in the room right now, which is amazing, but the longer that I've been in this industry and the more senior I get in my career, the fewer and fewer women that I see around me. And so this podcast is trying to dig into that problem a little bit. We actually have some folks here in the front who have been amazing guests, Colleen and Selena. And so just highlighting wonderful women that we have in the industry and the work that they're doing. So if you have a chance to give it a listen, and if you like it, if you could give it a share, I would really appreciate it, and you can contribute to hopefully solving this issue. And another plug, we have MDS Fest coming up in just 2 weeks. So because you're here, I assume you like conferences. MDS Fest is a totally virtual, totally free event. And we have over 60 speakers, some speakers who are actually here. I think Abby is on our list and a few others who have also been speakers here. So it's totally free, it's totally virtual, and I encourage you to sign up. You can sign up at mdsfest.com, and everything will be recorded. So if you don't have time to watch sessions live, you can catch them later. Just a quick blurb on what Secoda is. Secoda, I've been telling everyone the name, actually stands for Searchable Company Data. So that can kind of help you remember what we do. But we try to kind of be like Google search for your data stack and make everything discoverable for not just your data team, but also all the people who are in your organization. We have features like cataloging, lineage, governance, and monitoring is something that we also recently just added. So we're looking to kind of bundle more things in the stack and make it a little bit easier so you don't have to buy quite so many tools in your tech stack. Okay, we're done with the preamble, so let's dive into the whole reason that you're all here. So I'm going to start by saying probably the understatement of the entire conference, but a lot has changed in this industry over the last 10 to 15 years. And so starting off, we've gotten some new tools in our toolbox. If we go back to kind of the time when I started in data, the data stack looked pretty different. Some of these tools, most of them probably aren't even around anymore, and some companies are still on them, but I would imagine most of us have moved on. And this is really what things look more like today. So with all of the tools that are in this data stack, things have really changed. And it's gotten a lot easier to just build your entire data stack. You now don't have to necessarily go and set up something that maybe previously looked like this, a traditional data stack that was manual intensive, maybe a little bit hard to set up and have resources to maintain it. And now you can kind of just go and build and buy all of the pieces of your data stack. And so putting all of these pieces together can be relatively easy for someone maybe less technical to be able to set all of this up. And even one team, I'm a one-person data team, and I can set up a whole tech stack in an afternoon and manage this by myself, where in the previous world that would have been totally impossible. Companies have invested a lot in becoming data-driven as well over the last 10 or 15 years. So companies are basically all in on becoming data-driven. We got called sexy back in, I think this was 2012, when data scientists were called the sexiest job of the 21st century. And then data engineers got that title. And then the analytics engineers got that title. But regardless, companies were kind of all in on, let's throw money at this problem, let's invest, and let's build into becoming data-driven. But some things haven't changed, and I think for the most part, most data teams are still not very good, or we have a lot of challenge with measuring the value that we deliver. And when we think about ROI and the ROI of a data team, it kind of breaks down into value and cost at the most basic level. And unfortunately for us, it's complicated to measure this side of things and can be really complex with a lot of steps involved and a lot of resources into measuring this. And unfortunately, it's pretty easy to measure cost. If you aren't measuring it, someone on your finance team is probably measuring it and attributing that back to software costs that are probably aligned to your data team. And this was kind of okay because we grew up, the modern data stack sort of grew up during this period where there wasn't a lot of pressure on the system. Companies were allowed to crop up everywhere, tech companies, data companies. Were sort of building in this environment where the pressure to show ROI and profitability wasn't necessarily as important because it was sort of like growth at all costs, revenue growth, user growth was more important. And so the modern data stack and data teams along with it have really been growing in this period. And we know now that that's totally changed. That environment is now completely flipped, and we have a lot more pressure put on not just data teams, but companies in general. And now we have companies coming back to us and saying, what exactly is it that you do here? Like, you're very expensive, you have really big tech stacks, you're building all of this stuff, and you can't tell us what your value is. And so unfortunately, when you look at that ROI calculation, we get labeled as a cost center instead of a value driver. And we know what's the first thing to go when the going gets tough is that layoffs start to happen. And so this is obviously across the whole tech industry, but layoffs have been up in tech and in other companies as well. And for the first time, at least in my career, I'm hearing about data teams getting laid off. And that's not something that I had really encountered that often before, where typically there's a shortage of these types of roles. And it's been generally, I don't want to say easy to get a job, but it hasn't been as competitive as it has been lately. And so I don't think this problem is going anywhere. I don't know if anyone gets this reference, but I don't think this problem is going anywhere. And so as we look forward to this year and into the future, I think we're going to continue to be in trouble if we're not thinking about containing our costs as we're also trying to deliver value. All right, so thinking about the whole external situation, we've also got other problems too, and that is more in the market that we work in. And I'll say something relatively provocative, but just in the Dagster talk that was upstairs, I think this was also echoed, is that a lot of tools in the modern data stack are actually kind of designed for us to spend money. At the end of the day, like all of these tools were also growing up during this period of zero interest rate, so they also didn't have a lot of pressure on them, and now they're also in that same environment where they now need to grow into their valuation and they need to make money. And so, not that they didn't before, but the pressure is a little bit higher, and I think we're seeing pricing models change and things differ quite a bit. So we'll talk a little bit about why some of these things are. But essentially, a lot of the tools that you start out with in the modern data stack, typically the initial costs are pretty low. You can get started. I remember the first time that I used BigQuery, it was probably like 7 years ago, I was scared to run a query because I was like, oh my God, this is going to cost me money. Like, how much is it going to be? And I look and I run the query and it was like fractions of a penny. And I was like, oh, like, okay, I can run as many queries as I want. This doesn't matter. So you kind of have that false sense of security where you get started and there's really not a lot of pressure on the situation. So if you search for the cost of the modern data stack, at least in my search results, this is like the third blog post that comes up. So this is not my data. This is, just take this with a grain of salt. But this company, Syncari, put together this blog post where they kind of envisioned a scenario where a data team starts in year one, and then what would their scaling costs look like over the first 3 years? So obviously these numbers are going to depend entirely on what industry you're in, how much data you have, what your use cases are, what you're kind of building for the business. But I think the takeaway here is that even from year 1 to year 3, a data team can very easily scale, even triple their costs in the first 3 years of what they're delivering if you're not careful. And when you layer on the personnel cost, when you think about what you might need to run an infrastructure in year 1 versus what you might need from your people in year 3, you can really start to see these salaries really start to increase the cost of your data team significantly. And so if your finance team or your leadership team is looking at this, they're also going to be asking, okay, what is the value that you're delivering to justify these costs? Another big thing is that tools kind of abstract away complexity in favor of convenience. That's kind of what they're meant to do. But the problem with that is it's a bit of a double-edged sword, is that it allows a lot more people to enter the market, and sometimes maybe they have less technical skills. And so they're able to set up this tool without really understanding what's going on under the hood and what the cost implications might be longer term. So it's kind of like, take my money, like, I don't really care, we'll figure it out later. And essentially that can kind of create a little bit of risk in the longer term. Another big thing is that addition is very easy, so adding things to the system, not to pick on anyone, but like we use DBT, it's like very easy to add a new DBT model, to add a new view, to add a new table. In your BI tools, to add a new chart, to add a new dashboard. The problem is when you want to take something away. There's all of these dependencies that get layered on top of one another, and it becomes very difficult to actually remove anything without causing absolute chaos. This picture is actually from DBT, their Coalesce product keynote. So Tristan put this up on the board, and this is their internal DBT project. So this is kind of like, I don't know how you enter a system like this and figure out where to begin, even let alone trying to remove something. And then there's also an interplay of pricing models. So when we think about how pricing models work, typically if we look back at the stack, we, on the left-hand side, typically have consumption-based pricing models further to the left. And then generally, as you move towards the right, you're going to have more seat-based pricing. And what happens when you start to do this is when you start adding more seats to the right-hand side of the chart, that creates more demand on the system, which then flows back into the left-hand side in the consumption-based pricing. And so this is obviously kind of by design, like you're trying to add more people, but what can also happen with costs is that it creates this kind of snowball effect. So you might get more requests where you have to add more data volume. That translates into more data models that you have to keep updated, and then that turns into more and more compute, more data producers and consumers potentially putting cost into the system. Oops. The other thing is that cost and usage data is not easily exposed or aggregated. So this is probably like the biggest takeaway from my talk today is that it's not really easy for you to go to one place and say like, okay, how much is my team spending right now? And how can I go ahead and optimize that? So a lot of the tools that are in the modern data stack, especially consumption-based tools, will have some sort of reporting like this. But the challenge is that it's typically buried in some admin UI, and not everybody has access to it. So for example, in Fivetran, if you don't have access to billing or admin roles, you're not gonna be able to see this. And the other piece is that it's not very granular. It's just gonna tell you like a rolled up amount per month. So if you're trying to optimize this, you've already spent the money by the time that you're looking at this. You can get a little more granular. You can go into different connectors and sort of see like which connectors are driving the most and maybe which tables. But it's not super easy to kind of see this information in one centralized place. Clicker is acting up. Another example here is Airbyte. So Airbyte uses credits. So in this case, if I wanted to see how much am I spending every single day, the credit pricing model is actually different depending on what type of connector you have. So you would have to do some kind of backwards math to figure out what is my cost per credit for this particular type of connector and try to back that out to see, if you wanted to get spend on a per day basis, for example. In Snowflake reporting has actually gotten a lot better. I know they've added some even since I took the screenshot, they've added some recent features to their cost monitoring. And Snowflake, you can get a little bit more granular into the resources where you're spending money. And especially if you set up your warehouses and your user types in a way that allows you to kind of understand things at a more granular level, you'll be able to kind of attribute cost directly in the reporting tool. But it doesn't really let you get down to like a specific query level. So if you wanted to look at particular assets and how much, for example, a DBT model is costing you, that wouldn't be possible without a little bit of extra work. And then lastly, looking at your BI tools, you can start to dig into usage patterns. So this isn't going to tell you cost exactly. For Looker, obviously, things are usually annual contracts or seat-based. But you might be able to say, who's using the most, who's running the most queries, who's looking at the most dashboards. Can I attribute that back to some kind of cost in the warehouse? So the problem with all of this is that it's like the same problem that we're trying to solve for other teams that we now have to solve for ourselves. The data is siloed, it's in a bunch of different places, there's not really any metrics layered on top of it, and it's not aggregated in any useful way. So it's very difficult to draw insight from. And ultimately what this means is that data teams kind of fall into this trap where the relationship between cost and time or cost and data volume is like, at best, it might be linear, which is still not very good. That's going to be undercutting value. And at worst, it probably looks more like this. And I think a lot of data teams are finding this where things are actually starting to get like exponential over time. And we need to kind of work on figuring out how do we kind of change this pattern so that we control cost over time and as volume increases. Because ultimately, to deliver positive ROI, we need to control cost while we're still delivering or increasing the value that we're providing. Otherwise, our cost is just continually going to be undercutting ROI. So this is actually the second time that I've seen this meme at this conference. So I don't know what this says about us as data people. But yeah, basically, we don't want to just let the world burn around us. We have to kind of figure out a solution. So I have some recommendations of things that I've set up and things that I've tried. So the first step, not surprisingly, as data teams, is that we have to measure. So the first step is really mapping out your tech stack. And this might seem like a very obvious step. I'm sure most of you have probably already done it. But for someone like myself, I joined Secoda almost a year ago now. I'm coming into a totally new company as a head of data. And I know some of the tools that we have, but I don't actually know, like, okay, what's the pricing model for this one? What was the agreement for this one? I had to kind of go through and sort of map out what are all the data tools that we have. And so again, going back to our tech stack diagram, you can go and look at, where are all the data sources that you have that you're connecting, maybe what are your storage and compute, all of your serving layers. If you have a data catalog like Secoda, shameless plug, this is obviously a lot easier to do. But once you have all that list of all the tools that you're using, you can start to then just categorize it into what are the different pricing models that we have and identify, is this cost data something that I can easily expose and get my hands on? So this is a very spreadsheet exercise that I did of our data stack. So kind of looking at all the tools that we're spending money on as a data team, what are the different types that we have, what are the pricing models that we have for each of these, and then categorizing them into static or variable costs. Understanding the billing cadence and then even getting down into the granularity of your contract start and end dates, you can start to kind of triangulate around this cost information. And lastly, the data source is obviously very important. So figuring out where does this cost data live? Is this something that's easily exposed? Am I going to need to build maybe an API connection to get that data out? Thinking about breaking the cost data down into two categories, static versus variable. So static are going to be the things that aren't going to surprise you, hopefully. These would be annual or monthly contracts, plans. I put salaries here. Those, hopefully those don't stay static for too long. Or you won't have a data team anymore. But they're not going to surprise you, right? Like you have control over this. It's something that you can kind of determine ahead of time. On the flip side is the variable cost or the consumption-based tools that exist in our tech stack. And these are the ones that, unfortunately, sometimes we get surprise bills as data teams. How many people have gotten like a surprise ETL bill where it was way more expensive than they wanted it to be? Yeah, exactly. DLT in the back. Yes, this is a problem you're trying to solve, right? Yeah, so it's very unpleasant. I have made this mistake more than once myself, and so it's kind of one of those situations where something might actually be out of your control because a data producer upstream may have changed something or a data source changed and you didn't understand how that was going to update, and that flows down into the system and you get a really nasty bill. The warehouse obviously is connected to just about everything in your tech stack, and so when you start exposing that and making that available to data producers and consumers, you can start to incur costs in ways that maybe you didn't realize. And then if you're paying for tools like transformation and orchestration, a lot of those tools now have either seat-based or usage-based pricing for them. And then, I put headcount. Headcount should probably be in static, but because you're not just going to magically have a data person join your team. But that would be something that you can kind of flex a little bit on. So once you've kind of categorized and done all of this for your all of the things in your tech stack, then you can start to source and model cost data. So for us, we use dbt and Snowflake. So I'm going to share some examples of what we've done. So it's actually pretty easy for us because dbt and Snowflake, the team actually, at Select, Ian and Niall have built this open source package from dbt that will connect into the information schema in your Snowflake and basically just build like query level cost information for you. Super useful package. There are two other here that I listed. I will say I haven't actually used these. I think the dbt BigQuery one is pretty new. And then the Redshift one, I think you would have to do a little bit of extra transformation to get to cost information yourself, but potentially worth checking out. And then if you're on other systems, like being able to access the information that's in your information schema or something similar to that, you can probably start to figure out a way to back out cost information. For ETL, I put down here, like Fivetran has a connector where you can get into the logs and you can sort of back out, if this is what our MAR cost is, what are we actually spending on a different connector, for example. This is what the package looks like from Select. So you get a whole bunch of models right out of the box as soon as you install this package, which is really great. But I think for us as dbt users, we really focused on this model in particular, the dbt query model that shows you how much you're actually spending on a dbt query over time. And that allows you to actually think about it from an asset perspective rather than just query level information. So you can start to optimize those models over time. From the static cost, it's like maybe, I don't know if everybody wants to go to this level of granularity, but this is where I've gone with things, is that I've actually started to put into a seed file what our contracts are for our different static costs. And so by looking at whether we have annual contracts or monthly contracts, I can actually start to then extrapolate the cost and actually bring that into the dashboard as well so that I can really get a full picture of what we are spending every month. So taking that seed file and just extrapolating it out into a model, and then basically building like maybe just a rolled up monthly cost model, or depending on what level of granularity you wanted to go to, you could then, the top one is actually from the Snowflake package, the middle one is the Fivetran, and then the bottom one would be our static costs. So once you've got that model built, or something similar to it depending on your tech stack, you can then think about how you can build cost assets. So this is an actual dashboard that I've built for me to use, and essentially this is mostly focused right now on Snowflake cost. I'm going to look at bringing in our other costs later, But essentially, this is allowing us to see on a daily basis, what are we spending on Snowflake? And then it's annualizing that amount so that we can think about not just what am I spending today, but if this is starting to trend upward, what is this going to look like in the next year if I don't do anything about it? And I think that number really gives you the ability to think more broadly than just on the granular daily level. Even then looking at which packages you're spending the most on. So some packages that you add to DBT will create models, and there's cost associated with that. So starting to think about what is that going to cost for us if we continue to use these models? Are there ways that, if we're not using that package anymore, maybe we should remove it because it's actually costing us money. It also allows you to get more granular into actual user level information, which we'll talk more about in a little bit. But you can start to see who's spending the most. Typically it's me because I'm the only person on the data team. But if I think about spending, if I think about expanding my team story over time, I will be able to start seeing how much is each developer costing, and is there some kind of pattern in maybe what they're doing over time that we might be able to optimize. Something that was really interesting for DBT is to break it out by resource type. So one thing that I teach a lot about in my DBT course is this idea of test bloat. And so what I was noticing at my last company, Maple, was we had chosen testing conventions very early on that were very coverage focused, and we were almost being too conservative. We were testing everything, and people would just add tests everywhere, not really thinking about what the cost of that is. So it actually slows down your pipeline, but it's a SQL query every time you run a test. So there's a cost associated with that. So being able to actually see that number on the screen of how much we're spending on tests kind of puts a value behind that. And then even being able to dig into the most expensive DBT resources that you have. So what's model cost you in the last 30 days, and what's that actually going to be annualized over the next 12 months. So once you've got that asset, you can then start to optimize. So I'll shout out to Joe Reese and Matt Housley. I know they're not here, but they have this wonderful book that I'm sure many people are very familiar with. But thinking about the whole data engineering lifecycle, if we start at generation and move all the way to serving, you can kind of start to break down the different steps where you might be able to think about reducing cost. And these would be more conceptual things rather than just looking at data. But I think one of the big things with generation, if we start there, is that a lot of data teams, and maybe not data teams, but I know at least engineering teams, when I've joined an early stage startup, they've all instrumented the product analytics to just collect everything under the sun and then figure it out later. So you end up with an event table that's got hundreds of millions of events in it, and you really only need maybe 1 million of those events. So being more strategic about what data are you actually collecting, what is the data that the business actually needs, and how can you properly collect what is needed versus just picking up maybe, I think Snowplow calls it data exhaust from the different SaaS platforms that you might have. So sometimes it might be more cost effective to instrument your own data collection in the way that you need it rather than collecting data from a tool and then spending all this time and money transforming it into what you need. The next piece is the ingestion side. So being a little bit more conscious about only bringing in the information that you need, trying to look to maybe open source solutions, if you will, or potentially looking to maybe reduce the amount of time that the cadence that you're syncing information. When I joined both of my last two companies, when I went into Fivetran, for example, somebody had set up for all of our SaaS integrations to sync every 15 minutes. And I was like, is anyone using this data every 15 minutes? They're like, no, we just wanted to make sure that you had the most fresh data whenever you needed it. So it's those types of conversations where you're kind of saying what's the actual SLA on this data? How fresh does it need to be? We were able to go from every 15 minutes to twice a day, and it's been completely fine. On the transformation side, again, I think having conversations about SLAs, if you have monthly models that only need to be updated once a month, those don't need to be updated in every production run. So adding tags, doing things like that. And then the serving layer. So thinking about, does everybody need access to our BI tool? Yes, we want to democratize data and give data to everyone and do all those great things. But in some cases, maybe it's okay to just send someone a PDF report if they're not going to go in and be running their own queries. Maybe you don't need to spend so much on seats. And this is actually a real-world example of using that dashboard that I showed you a few slides ago. So we had, in one of our warehouses, we separate the warehouse by loading, transformation, serving, and monitoring. And in the loading warehouse, we started to notice that things were getting really expensive for some reason. The daily cost was kind of spiking as we started to add more records. So we started to sync more tables. And one thing I started to learn, this was actually after talking to the team at Select, is that Snowflake, when you set up a warehouse, it automatically sets up a 5-minute auto suspend limit by default. And for the most part, you can typically reduce that we went down to 1 minute, and we actually saw that it saved us 64% of our annual cost. So this change alone, it literally took me like 1 minute to change this, probably less, and that's going to save us like $3,000 a year. When we talk about ETL, so we had, I mentioned this earlier, we got burned by Fivetran like one too many times, not to call Fivetran out, but there was a situation where it was kind of like, okay, that really sucks. We don't want that to happen again. So we looked to moving to something open source. We happened to switch to Airbyte open source. I would love to try DLT at some point, Adrian. But we just decided to switch over to Airbyte open source and see how that would work for us. And by moving all of our production databases over to that, it actually brought down our row limit below, I don't know if people know this, but Fivetran actually has a free tier. I think it's a new thing, where you can, under 500,000 rows in a month, it's actually free. So now, because we don't really move that much data from the rest of our SaaS tools, we can then move the rest of that workload into a free tier. And the other piece about this is that it gives us switching power. So it gives us familiarity with multiple ETL tools. We don't really feel like we're all committed to one tool, and that we kind of feel like, we have a bit of a better handle on what a migration might look like if we ever wanted to get completely off of one tool or the other. This change alone saved us about $7,500 a year. These are obviously small numbers. We're a smaller company, but I think these are just great ways to think about it. Another thing is on the total cost of ownership. So another thing that I've noticed is, again, I mentioned this earlier, but a lot of the tools in the modern data stack kind of allow folks who maybe are a little less technical, business folks, to come in and sort of set up these types of tools. And so we have Segment set up, and we were fitting into this team plan pretty easily, but what we didn't really, I don't think people really thought about is how quickly are we going to scale out of this plan? So for a B2B company, it might make sense to start on this team plan, but as soon as your company starts to scale and you start getting more marketing traffic, you're going to be out of this plan very, very quickly. And so $120 a month sounds pretty cheap, but you're probably not going to fit into that seat-based plan forever. And so thinking about, what does the total cost of ownership look like if we were to actually switch to something open source? So maybe moving to something like a snowplow, you have to consider what are the resources for a data engineer or someone on the technical team to actually help us maintain this and set it up? What does the migration effort look like? It still may make sense for us to switch over to something like this, but those are kind of the types of analyses that I would be looking at doing. And lastly, we'll kind of wrap this up by talking about probably the most important part of all this. We've talked mostly just about tools and data and everything at this point, but we know that humans have to actually change their behavior in some ways. So when we talk about processes, I think it's kind of this mentality of using only what you need. I think there's often like, oh, we have all the data in the world, let's just bring it all in and figure out what we're doing. You don't want to be like so conservative that you're not delivering value and you're not getting things done, but I think there is kind of a pause that can be taken to say, what is this data actually going to be used for, and do we actually need it? Business need-driven SLA, so have those conversations with stakeholders. How fresh does this data actually need to be? Does it need it? Do you need it every 15 minutes, or is like a once daily update fine? The data exhaust versus data creation. Data exhaust being you're just collecting information from SaaS tools versus actually creating and collecting the information you need and the cost implications that kind of come with that. And then having some kind of asset deprecation process. So again, if you've got like a huge DAG, hopefully no one's DAG looks like the internal DBT project. But if you have something like that, maybe having some sort of a tool or potentially a process that's going to help you to actively remove things that aren't being used so you don't get to a place where you're terrified to pull any sweater string. When we think about workflows, this is something that I think with tools like DBT, you actually probably have a lot more people who maybe have come from like an analyst background and they, I know this was me, like I can write SQL, but maybe I didn't know necessarily about query tuning and I wasn't totally up to speed on how to make queries perform better. That was something I learned over time, but as a team lead, I want to make sure now if I have people on my team who are responsible for building queries that they know how to properly optimize them for performance and that they're able to kind of read a query plan, that sort of thing. The other piece is educating your data producers and consumers. So helping your engineering team understand, if you go change the schema of this table or you change all of this upstream information, that's going to have some of these implications for us downstream, and there's costs associated with that. The same for consumers. So if consumers are asking you to add more things and build more things, it's good for them to understand what those cost implications might look like. Building cost optimizations into your workflows. So what I mean by that is code reviews and feedback loops, as I have at the last point there, but thinking about what a model looks like over time. So this is actually one of our bigger models that we have. And so looking at how this has changed over time, based on the CI runs that we have run this model through, you can actually see where I kind of screwed up. I made a change in the last little bit there where something's not really working like it was before, and so I can actually then go back and make those changes. And so if you can think about bringing that actually into your code review process, I haven't figured it out yet, but I'm still working on it. That's something that I think that can make it more granular and make it something that the person is thinking about what is the cost implication of making this change. Setting up a cost monitoring dashboard and building alerting, if you're able to do that, will definitely help you kind of keep that top of mind instead of it being like an afterthought. And then a big piece of this is sharing accountability. So I know folks who basically have access to the warehouse, or if it's different data people on your team, putting a number in front of them and saying like, this is what you spent in our warehouse in a particular amount of time can be pretty impactful. I think that people kind of just assume like data systems work, and if they're not on the data team, they don't really understand. So having those types of discussions, bringing cost as a discussion into feature delivery so that people understand like, don't just ask for me to build a dashboard if you're not going to use it, because it actually there's costs behind building that. And then normalizing cost discussions, I think, is just something that I know I haven't had those discussions with my previous teams, so it's something I would be looking to do moving forward. And then thinking about scaling, so you'll notice in all of the charts, or I guess maybe the one main chart, is that I was looking at annualized projections. And so kind of always thinking about not just what am I spending today, but if I continue this trend, what is this going to look like in the next 6 to 12 months? And your finance team is probably really going to like that if they have a heads up on what you're going to be spending before you spend it. They'll be your pal. Tracking monthly and quarterly trends, so having maybe like a discussion about like what can we do if things are looking off. And then I think alerting is obviously one of the more important ways to dig into that. Just some quick watchouts, like be skeptical and avoid the linear scaling. I think this is probably more targeted at the business folks, but I think kind of jumping on a tool and thinking, oh, it's only going to cost us $120 a month, it's like, how long is that really going to last for? Ensuring that tool owners, so sometimes there's data tools that maybe we aren't the owners of, but we still have costs associated with it, making sure that they understand the total cost of scaling and the total cost of ownership and the scaling costs. Another one that I learned when I was at Maple was negotiating longer contract terms can actually help you to reduce costs. So if there is something in your stack that we're going to be using this, where it's not going anywhere, like AWS nodes, for example, if you buy like a year ahead or 3 years ahead and you reserve that, you can actually sometimes get like 30 to 40% discounts on that. So yes, your company will be paying up front, but that will be returned to you over time. And then I think a big one is like avoiding tool lock-in. So like I said earlier, a lot of tools in the modern data stack are now faced with the same problems that we are, and they can change their pricing plans. So if you're really dependent on them, you don't want to get stuck with them. So always, it's kind of good to have like one foot out the door. Don't be too committal with tools, just in case you need to move off of it. There are tool reduction costs as well. So I mentioned Select. I'm not sponsored by Select. I know I mentioned them a bunch of times, but I just think what they're doing is really great. So they do have a paid version of their tool where you don't have to build the whole dashboard that I showed you, and they do a whole bunch of other things as well. And I was looking for this because this could just negate my entire presentation, but we may have an autonomous AI solution where it kind of just does all this for us. That would be the best situation because we wouldn't have to think too much about it. I did find this company. I was doing a little bit of research into whether there's others. Again, I don't know Secoda, I haven't used the tool, but it does look like they're trying to build something like this where it can actually monitor usage and performance and actually make like autonomous updates, which is pretty cool. Okay, so we'll wrap it up. I know I've been talking for a long time. So invest in cost measurement and monitoring. I know we focus a lot on value and the value that we can deliver as data teams, and I'm not saying that that's not important, but I think the cost piece is becoming as important to at least have a sense of. Building cost containment feedback loops, so having, if you can build that into your PR process or you can have those discussions with your team members, that's going to make it a lot easier to manage on a smaller scale. And then I think maybe the biggest one is driving accountability, like showing people what they're spending, sharing the accountability with the data producers and the consumers, because ultimately cost is the whole business cares about it. It's not just the data team's responsibility. So that's it. So I would love if you want to link up with me on LinkedIn, we can chat some more. And thank you so much for coming.